Well,
you can talk about it in another response.
So before we actually talk about, so we wanted to give you a chance to think about the enabling environment and what you wanted to see in it. But before we get into a full discussion about the enabling environment, I want to talk a little bit about the Ngor commitments and the and the SDGs from the perspective of law in particular. Because it's, I think, when you're thinking about these aspects of law, there's sort of a different language when you're dealing with the way that states interact with each other. And so it actually falls more under the tent of international law as opposed to domestic law. So domestic law, sanitation law, what we've been talking about before, this is how international commitments, how international agreements are implemented at the domestic level. You know, everything that we talked about, constitutions, laws, legislation, regulations, policies, plans, that is an expression at the domestic level. And so there's going to be different expressions, different authorities, different experiences that play a part in how those international commitments are being implemented at the domestic level. But when it comes to international law, when we're looking at the Ngor commitments and at the SDGs, there really are two different lenses through which to view this. Now, the Ngor commitments do have some very good language in them. Here is primarily the language that the most operative language in the commitments themselves. So this idea of governments committing, that's good, that's strong language right there. And international law would look at that and it would say the commitment, this choice to commit to this is almost a binding commitment. But when we start looking at the individual commitments, you start to see that they're a little bit weaker in some ways. So focus on the poor, most marginalized and unserved, aimed at progressively eliminating inequalities in access and use, and implement national and local strategies with an emphasis on equity and sustainability. So focus is a great idea. It's a great idea that we should focus on these people, on the most vulnerable in our communities, is an important place to start. But how do you focus? What does that word focus mean? How do you define exactly what that obligation is and whether or not a government is meeting it or not? Now, you can create indicators. You can create goals that help keep governments on track. But this language itself, the word commit in that first phrase is important. But when you get to the focus, that term focus can have many, many different meanings depending on what country you're in, depending on how committed a government is. And so it can be a little bit more permissive. If you remember, we talked about that, it's more permissive in terms of the language because it has a lot of latitude for interpretation. Now, the second commitment also has that same component, mobilize support and resources at the highest political level. Mobilizing resources. You know, these are things that can be seen and can be identified. You are taking these steps, but the degree of which, how much effort are you putting into mobilizing these resources and mobilizing this support? These, again, are things which are going to be left to the government to determine. You can create indicators, you can try to keep governments accountable to certain standards, but if you don't have those, and if you don't set those smartly, then that mobilization component can, again, seem more permissive instead of mandatory. Now, I think the third one does provide a bit of an example of much firmer language. Establish and track sanitation and hygiene budget lines that consistently increase annually to reach a minimum of 0.5 GDP by 2020. That's a firm commitment. That's a real commitment. Establish, create it if you don't have it, and track, follow it, make sure you're seeing where that money is going. And the consistently increase annually. There's not a lot of room for interpretation there. Every year, there has to be an increase. Now, consistently might be a bit permissive. You know, what is consistent? Does it have to be the same amount every year? But that is firm language. And the goal that was set, 0.5 GDP by 2020, 4.5% GDP by 2020, that is a real target. That is a clear target. And so of these commitments, and I think if you look at the others, ensure strong leadership, again, something that is open to interpretation. Ensure inclusive, something which is open, number 6, ensure inclusive, safely managed sanitation services. They leave room for interpretation. Progressively eliminate. That has language that's similar to number 3, because you have that consistently increase, progressively eliminate. It sounds the same, but when I ask you, how do you determine whether or not a government is meeting this commitment, progressively eliminate? Do they have to be doing, how much do they have to be doing per year? How much money do they have to be committing per year? What kind of policy goals do they have to be setting year after year to know that they are meeting this target? Progressively does have a component because they can't go backwards. Policies can't go backwards. The laws can't go backwards. But it doesn't necessarily set clear, it doesn't say you will increase or decrease the amount of untreated waste that you have every year. It's not that clear. It doesn't have the same clear language as in number 3. Enable and engage the private sector. Again, different interpretations. Establish government-led monitoring, reporting, evaluation, learning, and review systems. That does have more firmness to it because it has that established you will create it if you don't have it. So you meet all of these different things, well, all of those different requirements. And then enable continued active engagement. Again, open to interpretation. How much engagement? You're enabling it, you're allowing it, but how much are you allowing? How much power are you giving for that engagement with the African process? But numbers 3 and number 9, they have much clearer language to them. Much clearer language to them. They create clearer commitments at the international level. So when you're talking about the Ngor commitments in particular, from a legal standpoint and evaluating these through a legal lens, these do create a those provisions create in some ways an impetus for change, almost like a policy for change. But a few of the provisions have more teeth, have more specificity, and have more requirements built into them. But this is not atypical of international law, particularly when you're dealing with international environmental law or anything dealing with rights. Actually, rights is a bad example, but certainly with an international environmental law. The language tends to be much softer. It tends to be much more about creating an environment without setting specific policy goals. Now, that's still good, because there are really 2 avenues to creating binding international requirements. The first is writing something down, creating an agreement, creating a treaty. But the other mechanism is developing customary international law, a practice among states that follows a certain pattern, that follows a certain path. And after a lot of practice and after a lot of following the same path, there becomes a rule of law that is developed. It comes into existence. And so when you have commitments like these, if you are encouraging governments to follow them, you can build this practice, build this customary practice that leads to legally binding obligations. Now, sometimes it takes a long time for these to become binding, for these to become actual mandatory principles and mandatory law. But it's a good step. These start to build that practice, and where it is clear, particularly our commitment number 3, there is a very clear mandate that is set that governments have to follow. So that's just looking at, from an international perspective, an international law perspective, the Ngor commitments. Now, the SDGs are a bit different as well, because the SDGs come from the General Assembly. Now, the language here, again, very strong, but you can see some of the same aspects, some of the same tricks of language that allow for a lot of flexibility. And flexibility can be good when dealing with these with different countries coming from different histories and different perspectives. You want to have flexibility built in. But the SDGs, again, from a normative standpoint, they aren't binding law. The General Assembly passed it as a resolution. It is something that has become part of the UN's practice. But as an actual binding set of requirements, these are not those. They set targets, they set goals, they set policy direction and pathways. But it is up to states to decide and to implement through their law to make it mandatory. States have to use sanitation laws, their domestic laws, to give these provisions life. So these help to set what those targets should be. They help to set a guide, a pathway, principles, standards essentially that can be met. But because of where they come from, because they aren't really inside of the UN, only the Security Council has the right to decide something, to make it mandatory automatically on states. These are more guiding, but it requires the state to take that implementation step through their own domestic law in order for them to have any sort of mandatory capacity.
So Luke gave you a sense as to what the purpose and the way in which the SDGs and Ngor commitments should be kind of seen and interpreted. I wanted to respond to your response to our question, because I think a lot of you made some very interesting points. So what exactly is an enabling environment, right? We talked about law, and now we're talking about an enabling environment. Ultimately, the answer is that the law itself creates that enabling environment. And many of you said that in different ways. So I will point out some that I thought were particularly interesting. One person said that the enabling environment means creating favorable conditions for the implementation of the Ngor commitment. So favorable conditions means you can actualize, you can operationalize what these say. So the SDGs, in terms of the targets and the indicators, are much clearer. You have a goal. If you have to, let's see, the proportion, you have to have the proportion of untreated wastewater. That is a goal that you can then decide steps on and create steps towards achieving that goal. But something larger, like ensuring availability and sustainable management, that is a really broad concept. That is not actionable on its own. It takes next steps. So the enabling environment law itself allows you to take those steps. It allows you to actualize and operationalize these different, very broad, visionary goal purpose statements. So the creating favorable conditions, that's exactly right. I would say some people talked about enforcement and accountability and having a budget. So a lot of people mentioned the financing aspect, and this is true. The only way in some respects is that you have to financing it. You have to put money behind it. And so the Ngor commitment saying that a certain percentage of your budget has to be dedicated, of your GDP has to be dedicated to this, is a huge advancement. It's saying, look, you have to fund this because you need money to do certain things. You have to, it's just a reality. You need money to implement new technologies. So that is one example of some kind of favorable condition. But budgeting and creating in your laws something that recognizes that as a requirement is a favorable condition. Something else that was said was enforcement and accountability. So enforcement and accountability, you're going to find those in pieces of legislation, you're going to find those in regulation, you're going to find those really in those two documents. But you're not necessarily going to find accountability in a policy or a plan or a strategy unless it has been made enforceable, unless it has been passed by a body that has that kind of enforcement authority, which is what was earlier asked. So if the Ministry of Water and Sanitation passes a regulation that comes in the form of a strategy that is enforceable, then that is enforceable. And that strategy may be something that can actually create actionable it can operationalize all these different visions. Something else that was said was to have an adequate legal and institutional arrangements to enable the execution of the required actions. So it's the enabling environment, not to use the word, but it's a great word, to enable the actual to operationalize these different concepts. So it's to actualize, it's to make it tangible. So I can't tell you what sustainable means. And I imagine if I asked people in the room what the term sustainable means to them, we would have over 20 different definitions and over 20 different ways of actually actualizing what that means. But in terms of regulations, that's when someone sits down and starts to frame out what that means. So when we talk about the enabling environment, we are talking about the legal, regulatory, policy, strategy, plan environment that you're working in. So that's ultimately one of the conclusions that we want you to take away, is that what is so important about legal and the legal and regulatory environment is that it creates those commitments, that it gives you a clear direction for how to actually take steps and what you need to do to create equitable access to sanitation, to create safely managed sanitation. It gives you it gives you steps to take. Otherwise, without those steps, you don't really know how to achieve it. And everyone's interpretation of it is going to be different, which means you might get very different approaches across a country, or you may get no action at all. Transparency, and this is also something that came up, and it's kind of tied to accountability, but a lot of people mentioned monitoring and reporting, which is huge. You cannot determine whether or not you are achieving a goal unless you have steps to get to it, and you have to have a way of measuring those steps. So you might have a goal of having the amount of untreated wastewater, but that isn't going to happen overnight, and you need to have steps to get there, because otherwise you have no way of measuring whether or not you are even advancing the goal. So oftentimes we talk about achieving a goal, but we should talk about advancing that goal. You have to be able to take steps, and those steps are often laid out in your regulation, or they're laid out in your legislation, and they're laid out in your policy. So you have to look at them. You know, if we think back to the South African example I talked about, that's what that does. And you see that development in thought, that as a piece of law is actualized, it's implemented, it's put into practice, then those little gaps and shortcomings come out, and you develop policy to further develop what that means, or to develop and to indicate to the government or other regulatory bodies, hey, we need to develop a law that does this, that gets us more into thinking about gender and inclusion and exclusive and access in a way that maybe the original law didn't. Investment. So we talked about the importance of budgeting, and actually I'm excited to see that part of it, because that is a way to hold your government accountable. It's a way to see in a very tangible and visual way that the government is putting dollars behind it. And then the way that you can ensure that they're effectively investing in this is to then have rules that govern how that investment has to be made. And the last point is civic engagement, and I saw that also in here. I saw it more communicated in terms of political will, but one of the ways that you get political will is by including the public. So if the government creates a regulation and there's no public participation, the Ministry of Water just decides to issue a regulation. As a citizen, or even as a utility, I don't feel like my thoughts and my expertise were taken into consideration, which means I may or may not make the effort to actually implement that. And so that matters, right? Because I'm sure a lot of you have had experience with the fact that laws as written and as they are stated on a piece of paper are not exactly what happens in practice. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. And sometimes it's because of budgeting mechanisms, so sometimes it hasn't been funded, and so it just isn't realistic or even possible to achieve it. Other times, the way that the language is written is too vague, so people don't know how to achieve it, and they just don't achieve it. Or they achieve it in the way that they think they should be. So then you get multiple interpretations across the country with everyone trying to achieve it, but they're not necessarily. So civic engagement helps to draw some of that out. It helps, the public knows a lot, and we need to rely on the public in order to get that perspective, because the public are experts and non-experts and citizens who are using these facilities. They are ultimately the end users. They should be engaged in determining whether or not my needs as a female or as a woman are being met. Is this toilet going to meet my needs? So that's important to have that civic engagement, and that generates buy-in. So these are some of the benefits of having this legal and regulatory environment, which creates the enabling environment. So they are really one and the same. And I wanted to bring it back specifically to sanitation. So as you'll notice, we keep kind of talking about the broader, the philosophical background to this, and then I try to keep bringing it back into sanitation. So the enabling environment, some of the work that we're doing, I already see a question, hold on to that. But some of the enabling environment is how you define it, right? So what am I looking for? When I'm looking for laws, or I'm looking at laws and regulations and policies and plans, what am I trying to pull out? And these are some examples of what I'm looking for. So I'm looking at laws that govern across the sanitation value chain. To me, if this is the reality, this is how sanitation services are provided in some way, not necessarily in a centralized context, but in a decentralized non-sewer sanitation. You have to contain it, you have to empty it, transport it, treat it, reuse it. Then I need to think about how my law actually deals with it along that realistic treatment schedule. And then there's other factors as well that I should be looking at. And I may not necessarily find these, again, as I've said, in sanitation-specific documents. I may find these in a water policy. I may find these in a development plan, which makes this more of an Easter egg hunt in terms of trying to find where all these little bits and pieces are coming from. And they may exist, but they may not exist in the document that you expect, or that other people who are tasked with implementing the document are expecting to find it. So financing and tariffing, we've talked about that in budgeting. Low-income households, considering, does the sanitation policy actually consider low-income households? Monitoring and reporting, how do we generate that accountability and transparency? Vulnerable populations, beyond just low-income households. You know, how are we taking into account their needs? We talked about technologically agnostic. Does the policy or the plan or the law deal with, recognize, acknowledge non-sewerage sanitation as a potential option? Is it more about the standards or is it more about the technology? Is that what we want? Citizen engagement, rural and urban and peri-urban, right? These are very different contexts in which these services are being provided, and you need your policies and laws to recognize that. You need your enabling environment to recognize the realities of providing these services. Public institutions. So how am I going to provide sanitation to schools or prisons or daycare facilities? Emergencies and natural disasters. Most countries experience some kind of natural disaster or man-made disaster at least once a year. So what kind of sanitation provisions do you have in place to deal with those special circumstances? And then enforcement. So these are also, there might be different enforcement mechanisms. Are there civil penalties? So am I fined when I don't do something? Is there a way to stop me from doing what I'm doing? If I'm discharging something without a permit, is there a way to stop me from discharging untreated wastewater? So is there a way that once I set the rules and I set the norms and the standards, is there a way to make sure that someone is complying with them? Because ultimately, that's also what matters, that you want people meeting the standards, but in order to ensure that that's happening, you need some kind of mechanism that ensures that that can actually take place, that there's someone checking on people, that there's someone reviewing permits or reviewing your actions. So this is what the enabling environment for sanitation might look like. And there's other factors that should be considered as well, but this is just a taste of what you might look for in terms of determining whether or not your country's law, writ large, actually creates the right enabling environment for sanitation.
So one point that I wanted to add is that a lot of these things can be accomplished either through policy or through law. You can have a policy that lays out all of these things in a very nice way, and the difference between the two in many ways is that the law it's not that it's immutable, but it creates something which is more binding. It's harder to change oftentimes, and so it creates something that can be enforced in court. It creates something, not that that should always be the mindset, is how do we litigate this? How do we make a government do something? That's not necessarily the goal all the time. But the idea is that with a policy, there's more flexibility, but there's also less predictability. So policies can change. Laws, once they're written and once they're developed, they have much more of a place in that normative framework. They fit within the Constitution. They create rights that can't be reversed oftentimes. The policies tend to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more easy to move around and to change over time, particularly since they tend to have expiration dates. Policies last for 3 years, or there'll be a policy vision for 10 years or a 10-year plan, whereas laws set more of a normative framework that doesn't necessarily have that same sort of expiration date on it.
And actually, to answer one of the questions that I finally remembered that was asked earlier was, how do you actually implement this at the national and local level, right? So these commitments that Luke talked about, the Ngor commitments, the SDGs, the question is, how do you make this something that you can actualize in your own context? And this is where you start. You have to understand where your existing laws are acting, and it's not necessarily going to be in a sanitation policy. There's a lot of countries, especially if we're talking about the African context, and even if we're not talking about it, there's a lot of countries that don't necessarily have a national sanitation policy. They don't necessarily have a national water law where you would find ways in which you would deal with the discharge or the release of wastewaters, which would include wastewaters from, that have been contaminated with fecal waste. So you want to look here. You want to look for these factors, not so much just the law, but you want to look across different laws like water laws and sanitation laws and development plans to see how these different factors are actually treated. That is where you're going to this is where you will start to determine whether or not you have created an enabling environment for sanitation in your country. And once you've determined that, you can start to match them against the Ngor commitments and the SDGs. So how much does your law really start to define what sustainable, safely managed sanitation looks like? That is a really broad statement. So what does that mean for your country? You have to define what that means. Now, there might be a generally recognized, understood principle for that, but there may not be. Or your country may have a more significant goal, or maybe because it has farther to go, it has to start small and then build into something that's greater. So maybe it starts with a quarter of the untreated wastewater is managed by this date, and then it grows into that. But the point is that you want to understand and you want to look at your existing legal framework, so the laws, the policies, or regulations, to determine how these factors and others are creating that enabling environment. So this is where you start. This is how you determine whether or not you have an enabling environment for achieving the Ngor commitments and the SDGs. So we get to hear your opinion again. And I hope we didn't use all the sticky notes because I don't think I have many more. But I think we're going to stick with question 1 just for time reasons. But the first question is, and you can take a few minutes to answer this, but where in the sanitation sector do you need the law the most? Where do you feel like your country doesn't have an enabling environment for achieving one of these Ngor commitments? So I pass that to you, and you can start to scribble away on your sticky notes. And if you don't have one, I do have a few I can hand out. So put your hand up if you need a sticky note, and I can try to help you. So you take a few minutes to think about this, and I will leave it open that if you have more to say about question 2, feel free to write about question 2. Just let me know. Okay. Anyone needs sticky notes? Everyone understand what that question means, by the way? Okay.
So Alexander will be coming around to collect.
So the reason that we ask this question is that this demonstrates the opportunity for you and for us and where we most need to be working in terms of creating that enabling environment. So it helps us to give it a sense from your experiences in terms of how we should prioritize our time when we're looking at laws and policies and those issues that you in your work are identifying as priorities. And so this is a little bit of a different question, but it's very interesting to see some of the similarities throughout them. So one, I will say that I see it consistently is standards for fecal sludge management. And this has actually been identified to us in other contexts as well, is that oftentimes there is no guidance for what kind of standard you need to treat, to which you need to treat fecal sludge. So that's a great point. The reuse of water and wastewater, so the production of used water treatment. So the fact that there are no standards in that area as well. I see some themes in terms of standardization. So this is a huge theme that comes up in some of the work that we see as well, is that there isn't necessarily a standard approach either across a country or across a sector or across countries throughout Africa. And this is in actually a few ways that we've seen it. So standardization in terms of the actual equipment being used. And so that means that one neighboring community can go to the next neighboring community and say, hey, my VIPs have this problem, can I borrow equipment from you? It doesn't necessarily provide that opportunity because everyone's using such different technologies. So having a standard approach in that way, but also having standards just generally in terms of what is the goal? So how am I, as I said before, how am I really supposed to be achieving sustainably, safely managed sanitation? And one of the ways in which you can do that is through the ISOs, which is an international standard that can be used to essentially achieve that standardization across a country and across communities. Some of the other areas in which I see is generally the sanitation value chain, which is huge. The fact that there's a number of people who have said throughout here that the sanitation value chain itself is lacking regulation is a significant issue, especially if countries are starting to turn to non-sewered sanitation. This is also an area that has become apparent to us too, that there are oftentimes regulations focusing specifically on centralized, so if you have some kind of large treatment work, that there are standards that govern the large treatment works, but there aren't standards that necessarily define and govern non-sewered sanitation. And especially if non-sewered sanitation is seen as a more effective and efficient way of moving forward with access to sanitation in certain communities, then that is something that we definitely need to have in place. So it's interesting to see.
Another one that I'm seeing on the post-its on this side are looking for particular prohibitions on bucket toilets, on open defecation, and those are actually laws that have come into place and sometimes have unintended consequences. You can create a very clear prohibition on those types of technologies and on open defecation, and they can have a real impact because there can be real punishments for that for open defecation or for implementation of bucket toilets, but without something else, without also having a commitment, a requirement that that the people, so communities that are using open defecation are provided something like ablution blocks or provided some sort of other mechanism for sanitation, other technology, or you're getting rid of the bucket toilet system, but you're not providing anything else. You need to have that balance, and the commitments or the requirements under the law should be the same. You shouldn't be just taking away something without giving something in return. So the law also can serve that balance. One thing I will highlight, though, is that the language of the law is very important. We looked at the Ngor commitments, and I sort of talked through how the language works from a legal lens. But the way that these laws are developed, the language is going to be absolutely critical as well. When you're creating that accountability, when you're creating government accountability, what does that look like? Oftentimes governments and their policies and their laws will say, we will do this to the extent that we are financially able to do it. There's a caveat. And you have to look, when you're evaluating the laws, you have to look at the language in particular. Do you see that shall, that must? Do you see those binding, those rules? Or do you see those caveats that allow it to be limited by how much money is available? Because that can be that can be exploited. And it's important to make sure that you're looking for that language so you can look for where people are avoiding following certain rules. But I will say there is also a lot of government accountability on these post-it notes as well, including some questions. And that is always the difficult question. And I think processes like the Ngor commitments and the SDGs can help with that, because they are creating a path. They're creating at least a standard path for a lot of countries. It's still up to the domestic implementation, but that there is a greater transparency when you have these international mechanisms. There's a greater exposure when you have these international mechanisms. But there also has to be, in addition to government monitoring and reporting, having strong CSO reporting as well is also very strong. It can help to make sure that accountability is real and that targets are being met. I wanted to add just something to standardization. That is also a way of helping to implement technologies. If you use international standards or regional standards, it can be much easier to make sure that you're using the best available, the best practicable technologies, because those standards can set essentially guidelines for how VIPs or how different types of toilets and infrastructure should be built. And those if you're using international standards, they can create a common language that will allow for, as Alexander said, the ability to share and to maintain technologies a lot more easily, because you're dealing with economies of scale, but also making sure that everybody is working towards the same standards and developing things sort of in lockstep, as opposed to allowing it to be done in 54 different ways.
Okay, so with that, I will conclude our presentation, and I'd like to open it up to the floor for any general questions that you might have for us that are not the questions that are listed here. Trevor? We need a mic up front. If you just raise your hand, we will make sure a mic gets to you.
Yeah, hi, my name is George de Gooijer. Not so much a question, but more a remark. You can't offload on law, and you can't offload on policy. These are not things that are going to solve the problem by itself. It's always the combination that you need. So you need law to sort of understand where you're going, but at the same time you need also in that law flexibility, because otherwise you can't change where you made an error in your creating of that what you initially wrote. Mm-hmm. So I would like to argue that the law needs to be to some sort flexible, so it's nice to have a framework within which you have implementing text and make a sort of a distinction between those two. And it only works if you have a civil society and other actors in the whole system that complete that what you're starting with a law in the first place. So it's part of the story. It is not sort of the thing on which you can leave it to the law, because it will sort of protect you. It won't protect you unless it is used by society.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. My name is Mario. I work in Nairobi City, and I work with the Kenyan government. The issue of, some of the issues we've learned in terms of the constitution and legislative implementation in the area of sanitation, we've come to realize that you have also to have a very vibrant opposition to put on check the government, because sometimes the requirement of the constitutions might not be followed strictly without checks and balances. Mm-hmm. Also, the issue of organized, vibrant civil society and public benefit organizations, and they are playing great role in our country, but they are not properly structured, and whatever they want to be passed for it to have an input on the policy process and legislative process might not be captured. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Hello? So it's on. I was just really curious to know, in your opinion, what are the major barriers to moving forward on a legal framework for sanitation?
It's a great question. Let me take one more and then.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, sanitation has a multi-sectoral nature,
Mhm.
and multiple stakeholders are also, involved. And when we talk about sanitation law, we may have, one set of, law, policy, and so on, administered probably by one sectoral institution or 2, 3 sector institutions. Would there be a need for looking at sanitation also within the context of other sectoral policies and laws? Probably I feel that that's where there is a lag in terms of meeting our sanitation commitments. Thank you.
Great. So I will just respond to those two questions, and I think actually I can almost respond to them at the same time. I would argue that the largest issue, or one of the greatest challenges in actually implementing sanitation law, is that it's unclear as to who is supposed to be doing what. So the governance and the institutional structures, it's often unclear because it's a multi-sectoral issue and because it's across a number of ministries. So if you don't have your water and sanitation or your sanitation in one division, it's harder to ensure that everyone is acting across and in a complementary kind of way. And so it's, in terms of not only across the sectors and across the ministries, but even from the national down to the local level, is that you really need very strong and very clearly defined institutions in order to implement anything. People have to know what their scope of authority is, and it has to include whatever your goals are. So your scope of authority has to be inclusive, which yours may not, but as you said, it might be in another ministry. And it's unclear as to whether or not one ministry would know that another ministry is doing something. So for instance, if discharges from any kind of facility that's typically deemed a water issue. So if you're discharging wastewater from a treatment facility, that's under your water resources management, your water resources ministry. It may not be connected to your sanitation, even though it is a sanitation issue. Now the question is, do you have to centralize it, or do you just have to have some kind of sharing, communicative mechanism? And it's unclear. It depends on the government, and it again depends on how clearly stipulated your institutional structure is. Okay, I want to be able to take other questions, so Luke.
There was for balance, there was one French question, and I know there were two up front, so.
Ok, moi je vais parler en français. Moi je voulais revenir sur la question, bon, mon nom c'est Haïti. Question numéro 2 là. Souvent les lois sont écrites, mais dans la pratique c'est autre chose. Est-ce que vous pouvez me dire davantage qu'est-ce qui doit se faire? Merci.
Do you want to repeat the question in English for those who don't have translation? No?
They're translating it right now. Okay.
There were two other questions.
Oh, okay. Yes, we'll take those.
I'm Eva from Kenya. I'm from the private sector. My question is from the private sector, where you have the constitution and you have the law, but you have different ministerial government departments who you are under, and they regulate you, but the laws contradict each other. And as a private sector, you don't know which to follow. If you follow this one, if you follow A, you're in trouble with B. If you follow B, you're in trouble with C. So how can this conflict be tackled out so that from the private sector, there's harmonization in whatever work we want to do based in sanitation?
That's a great question. And I love how you guys are lining them up because they seem to almost answer one another. So in terms of, here's a great example where her example is a great example of where the law as written is not working in practice. So the laws independently could be fantastic. They could set forth wonderful standards that clearly are going to achieve the goals that have been set out. The problem is that they contradict each other. So in practice, just in a realistic way, a private utility or a private industry doesn't know which ones to comply with. what would you do in that set of circumstances? It takes CSOs and NGOs to raise that, and private utilities themselves to demonstrate and to show, here's what I'm expected to comply with. I can't comply with both of them. So where's your cooperative mechanism between these two ministries to identify, here are the challenges, and then to, as yourself, even as a CSO or a private industry, here's how you would how you would rectify that issue. So some of it is bringing it to an awareness. People may not know. Maybe the ministries, because there's no cooperative mechanism, as we talked about, the governance and institutional model is divided, and they have no idea that they're actually competing at cross purposes, that somebody needs to tell them. Someone needs to say, I literally cannot comply with both of your sets of regulations. And then to offer suggestions as how you would need to change that so that you can. In terms of, and this is a great example of how sometimes the way that the law is written doesn't work out in practice. Some of it is just enforcement. So I may say that there's a certain standard that must be achieved. There's no open defecation is allowed. Well, if no one is actually enforcing it, as someone said in their sticky note, then it's kind of a meaningless norm because someone actually has to be there to comply. So the law is very clear, no open defecation is allowed, but if it doesn't offer steps for how you get there, then that's also in practice, it's not really, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't provide you a step-by-step way to get there. So that you may have a very strong norm and no policy or regulation that will allow you to implement that. And that's where some of these divides come into place. Those are just a few examples. If you have other questions, please feel free to come up to us afterwards. I do want to make sure that we stay on time, and it is 4:02. So I want to thank you so much for joining our session, and have a great day. Okay, well, it seems like someone is moving our slides forward, but in case you're interested, we have a few initiatives that we're working on as an organization. We're creating the first Pan-African water law platform, which does just this. We are starting to look at laws across 10 different nexuses and sectors so that you can actually know what's happening. And if you're private industry, you know that regulations are conflicting with each other. And we have the Blue Phone, which is an initiative that if you have an issue or if you have a legal question, you can call us and we can try to answer it for you. So it's a little bit of like a legal helpline, but in more of a research way. We do not help with litigation. We help more in answering these questions like the young woman here said. What do I do when I have competing regulations that I have to meet? It's a great question that we would help to answer. And if you're interested in actually contacting us, there's our contact information. So thanks.